Welcome to one more edition of Move to Amend Reports. I'm Egberto and
I'm Laura Bonham. How are you tonight, Egberto?
So far so good. We're after having a very cold start to the the autumn. We suddenly got pretty darn warm, but we understand there'll be a freeze coming next week. How's it with you?
Well, I think I think the whole country is experiencing some pretty severe weather lately. The Northeast has been getting pounded by early snowstorms, and we here in the Rocky Mountain West have had unusually cold temperatures. It heated up a little today. It got up into the mid-30s, so we had rain on top of snow, and now we have ice. So,
ouch!
But we're going to have our white Christmas. That's for sure. And speaking of Christmas, this is the last show we have before the Christmas holiday, and we have a really special guest with us tonight. Jeff Clements, an attorney and author, is the co-founder of Free Speech for People, a national non-partisan campaign to challenge the creation of constitutional rights for corporations, overturn Citizens United versus FEC, and strengthen American democracy and Republican self-government. He is the author of the book, Corporations Are Not People, which you can buy through the Move to Amend store. And he's also the founder of Clements Law Office, LLC, which has represented and advocated for people, businesses, and the public interest since 1988. Among his many other accomplishments, Jeff served as Assistant Attorney General and Chief of the Public Protection and Advocacy Bureau in the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. Welcome to the show, Jeff. It's a great pleasure to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, Laura. Great to be here with you and Egberto as well.
We often mention your book, Corporations Are Not People, and as I said, we carry that as one of the basic books that we think all people should read as a primer to get them ready and in understanding the issues that lie in both of our organizations and why we're doing what we're doing. Are you going to be penning a new book soon?
Well, it's interesting you ask. I've been holed up in the snow here in Massachusetts trying to finish with a February 1 deadline. It'll actually not be a new book, but it will be sort of a new book. It's going to be an update of Corporations Are Not People, and it's coming out in time for the fall, the 2014 elections. And it's going to update the original book, which was out in 2012, but so much has happened since then, including a national election and many more what I call now the corporate veto cases, where the courts are striking down laws based on corporate rights. That's on the negative side. But also a lot has happened on the positive side, with Move to Amend and many other groups working so hard and so well to advance this constitutional amendment movement across the country, that there's much to update. So I'm going to be working on that, and when the book comes out, I hope people will continue to look to it as a resource for this big historic struggle that we're in right now.
That's good news. So, and be sure to let us know when it hits the stand so we can let our listeners and members know. A couple of cases are in front of the Supreme Court right now. Will they be included in the book? And maybe you could speak to them a little bit. There's McCutcheon versus FEC and the Hobby Lobby case.
Yeah, for sure. These, the Supreme Court seems to always find time for taking more cases that will empower the very wealthy and empower corporations even more. And they've continued that since Citizens United. And the two you mentioned, Laura, this term involve really both sides of the Citizens United problem. That is the money in elections, the dominating money of the very few in our election systems, and the fabrication of corporate rights. So starting with the McCutcheon case, you mentioned McCutcheon versus FEC. McCutcheon is the name of a fellow, Sean McCutcheon. He's a CEO of a company that makes a lot of money in mining and other extraction industries, and he's upset that there's an aggregate limit on individual contributions to congressional, federal candidates, and the limit's very high. It's something like $128,000. So if you think of what most people make in a year, you could give away all your money for several years to candidates and still not approach the aggregate limit for most people. But for Sean McCutcheon, it's not enough. He wants to give more money to control how politicians behave. And so he says the aggregate limits based on Citizens United in the Buckley case violate the First Amendment. So that's going to the Supreme Court. It was already argued. In an oral argument, it looks like the same 5 justices that decided the Citizens United case are leaning towards, it appears, this is guesswork of course, but it appears leaning towards striking down these limits on campaign contributions and adding some of the math shows it could be just millions and millions of dollars of total additional money. That's on top of everything else we've seen in the election. So that's one major case that we're certainly watching and will be significant this term, and that means sometime before June. So the other one, though, that you mentioned, Hobby Lobby, is very interesting. When Citizens United was decided, I'm sure you know and have heard sometimes the same arguments or points of view that we've heard, that it's really just about Citizens United, it's about money and politics and it's elections. What's all this corporate rights stuff? Well, the Hobby Lobby case, as it's called, makes very clear what Citizens United was about. The lawyers for a corporation called Hobby Lobby, which is a chain of stores that employs 13,000 people. This is not a small mom and pop shop. It's a major corporation, employs 13,000 people. And the corporation, citing Citizens United, says that the health care law, the Affordable Care Act, which requires that employees have access to health insurance policies that provide a minimum of coverage, including for birth control, the corporation is arguing that violates its free exercise of religion rights, not just of the owners of the corporation, the 2 owners, husband and wife, who claim that their religious views, and I have no reason to doubt this, I respect their religious views, they claim their religious views require them to oppose certain forms of birth control, but they go further, and the corporation is claiming that it has free exercise of religion rights under the First Amendment and can deny this kind of health insurance to 13,000 employees. So that's extraordinary that we now have a corporation claiming to, take the most fundamental of human, spiritual rights. Literally the human activities of spirituality and worship, and using those to strike down laws and deny access to health insurance and birth control to employees based on that kind of fabricated corporate right. So that's the other case. It's unclear how it will come out. The circuits below the Supreme Court have divided. Some of them have, in fact, found such a right, and others have not. So the Supreme Court will decide that again sometime before June. And I certainly hope to get some discussion of both cases in my book. And if the Supreme Court decides it, we'll see where it goes. At Free Speech for People, we intend to file a brief in the Hobby Lobby case, arguing, of course, that the Constitution's about human rights, not a tool for corporations to use rights to strike down our laws.
Now, Oh, go ahead, Laura.
No, go ahead, Egberto. I was just going to say, every time I read about Hobby Lobby and I get that one really gets me. I've been, active my entire adult life, and long ago I got used to losing, or I got used to, just how low will people, just how low will they stoop. But this one about corporations exercising religious freedom is just totally beyond the pale, as far as I'm concerned. It's amazing that it's even part of reality. But go ahead, Egberto. That was all I have to say. It's scary.
Yeah. Well, Jess, I am not a lawyer, first of all, but from a layman's point of view, I'm an engineer, so I only think in very practical, black and white terms most of the time. What I see, and please tell me where I'm wrong or how I should be thinking about this or how we should all be thinking of this. But it seems to me that if a corporation is deemed a person as these constitutional interpretations have thus far, that consistency will demand that Hobby Lobby wins its case and the corporation be allowed a religion. And it seems to me that if money is really free speech, that these other companies or McCutcheon, who wants unlimited amounts of monies to be at his will, he should also prevail. I think if he, and again, tell me where I'm wrong, I think if it doesn't prevail, it's something that we'll continue to revisit up and until we really get what we ultimately want to get, which is a constitutional amendment that codifies that corporations simply are artificial entities to be governed by law and have no inalienable rights whatsoever. So please enlighten me.
Well, I hope I can. I'll do my best. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court is not consistent and hasn't been on this issue and others, but particularly on the issue of the rights of corporations. The Supreme Court over the years has been all over the map, and about money in politics for that matter. Citizens United, a 5-4 decision, reversed a case that had been decided exactly the other way on the question of the McCain-Feingold money in elections law. The case had gone exactly the other way, saying it was perfectly constitutional to limit corporate money and to exclude corporate money, corporate spending in elections in 2003 in the McConnell case. So the only thing that changed is Sandra Day O'Connor retired and Justice Rehnquist died and were replaced by Samuel Alito and Chief Justice Roberts. So even on the court, these fights these disagreements and the debate goes on. And so it's not clear entirely which way in any of these cases the court will go. I think for the reasons you say, Egberto, it's likely that they'll push that way because the 5 in the majority in Citizens United are just very ideologically driven to impose their sort of version of corporate power and money in politics. But if you look back in the long view over I think both over the entire history of our country, but even going back to the sort of birth of the modern corporate rights movement, which in my book I trace to Lewis Powell and the so-called Powell Memo, and he went on the Supreme Court and created this corporate speech idea. Even in those years, the court has gone back and forth. So I think the fight's still on in the court. At the same time, though, I agree with you. This is the court and the lawyers have done their best and mucked it up, and the American people need to settle this question. And the constitutional amendment vehicle is how we settle these big questions of, really who we are as Americans. And I think the big debate in our time, as in past times, is what is the place of corporations? Do they make the rules for us, or do we make the rules for them? And, what is the place of equality in elections and politics? Are we really all equal, or does money decide who has the most say? I think those are the 2 huge questions that Citizens United poses to the country, and the amendment movement is answering those questions. And I think in the end, like all of the fundamental questions of American constitutional law, the big ones, when the court can't get it right and is divided, and it has to be settled by the American people. And that's what's so exciting and what's so crucial for the constitutional amendment movement that we're all working to advance.
Well, one other question here. Do you know, and again, coming from the neophyte with respect to the law, what precedents we have on this issue internationally? Are we the oxymoron here, or exactly where do we stand with regards to the corporate personhood?
Well, I'm no international lawyer, so I certainly couldn't do a survey of what other countries do on this issue. But I guess I'd answer it two ways. I think, the root of the American Constitution and the sort of ideal, we're never there, and hopefully we're working to get closer. But the ideal of the American Constitution is that it's based on fundamentally inherent human rights that we're born with, literally. If that's the case, as I believe it is, corporations aren't included in the word person and people in the Constitution. That's an idea that I think is both accurate, but also a reflection of the revolution that we had, and our peculiar in a good way, our peculiar circumstances of when and how our revolution happened. And constitutions in other parts of the world, of course, were written at all sorts of different times, and many of them are much more modern. But I don't think there's any successful democracy that empowers corporations to share the rights, the fundamental rights that human beings have. It is not how it's done in Europe and Canada, and as far as I can tell. And I think one good way to look at that, as I said, I'm not an international lawyer, but if you look at the results, I often talk about GMO labeling. So labeling for genetically modified food, and I tell the story in my book of Vermont's effort to simply label dairy products that came from cows that were treated with Monsanto's genetically modified bovine growth hormone. This is a drug that was banned in virtually every democracy in the world. Throughout the European Union, Canada, Australia, every democracy in the world, the people did not want this in their dairy supply. Our country, not only was it not banned, the FDA sailed it through, and then when Vermont so much as tried to say, we're going to label it so people can at least decide for themselves, that was struck down as a violation of corporate speech rights. So, if corporations have that kind of power to turn to constitutional rights to invalidate laws, they use it like they did with the GMO labeling situation, and we were the only democracy where that happened. And I think we see that over and over again with labor laws, all sorts of examples, where in America, unfortunately, until we fix this problem of the fabricated constitutional rights for corporations, we effectively have this corporate veto that operates to strike down public policy that other democracies simply don't seem to have the same degree of that kind of a problem. Now, I know you, in the past on this show, in fact, have talked about the TPP and the global trade treaties, which we don't have to get in here. I know you've covered it well in the past. That creates a whole other problem, of course, of the global corporate power. That is a global problem, no question.
Actually, there was a question I wanted to ask about the TPP later on, but let me go back to see if Laura has anything else, because there are a couple other questions that I have, but let's see if Laura has something that from what you've said before. Laura? Well,
I was going to go in the TPP direction in that we just have done a show on that, and in terms of it being this deal more than others, but all of these free trade deals cumulatively are actually creating this global constitution. And with the TPP, these European countries that you mentioned that have labeling requirements and have outlawed the growth hormone and stuff will find themselves in a tough position once Monsanto can exercise its rights through this TPP, which completely destroys any country's
local sovereignty.
Basically, that their constitution, it overrides their constitution. Not that the TPP, making it clear that the TPP is the Pacific Rim countries, so it wouldn't include Europe, but it's designed to let other countries get in, and if this one passes, it sets a precedent for future ones and so forth. So, please speak to that.
Yeah, I think that it's a very serious problem, and the reason I think it's such a serious problem is the secrecy and the lack of not only transparency but participation by any kind of semblance of a democratic process, small d democratic process, to negotiate these treaties. So the TPP, of course, refers to Trans-Pacific Partnership, but there are other a web of global trade treaties, and they are negotiated under this fast-track authority in secret, and fast-track means essentially it comes to the floor once it's all negotiated. There's been zero input from people and privileged and secret input from corporate representatives, and it goes to Congress with simply essentially saying approve it or else, or essentially approve it or not, but it's not open to discussion, negotiation, debate. It's an up or down vote. That's how fast track works. And I think we do see, and we have seen already, and this would be a further culmination of it, of essentially an emergence of a global corporate government is too strong a word, but framework is a good word for it, that really does supersede sovereignty of the countries. Now, one could argue whether the countries, by signing on, ceded some of that sovereignty, but I don't think Americans really, have had a debate and decided, sure, we'll cede our sovereignty, and so that we can drive wages down and have no idea what's in food that's generated from someplace anywhere in the world where we're not allowed to know where it comes from. I don't think Americans would agree or be willing to cede that kind of sovereignty, which is why it's done in secret, and it's exactly why I think there's an increasing movement to stop fast track, to force much more transparency, and I think that's a very important movement. I don't think it replaces the very significant work we have to do to overturn Citizens United. We do have to fix the place of corporations in our own, Constitution, and in our country. We got to get it right. But that won't be enough. Even that big struggle, we have to get that done if we have any chance, I think, of really doing the larger effort, which is really, I think a struggle for, humanity and a sustainable globe, and that is a global effort that I think more and more people are recognizing. We have to do all of those things, local, national, international, at the same time.
Now, one of the issues. Oh, go ahead, Lauren.
I was going to say we have to fight corporate rule on a day-to-day basis while we fight corporate rule for eternity.
Well, yeah, and I think also, it's so important that what we do in terms of overturning Citizens United, of getting a more accountable, transparent, effective democracy, that our vision of what the American Republic is all about. If we can get that right, I don't think the kind of secretive, fast track, corporate representatives only negotiating process would be allowed to happen. It would force the change. I mean, if you had a Congress and a executive branch that were not so dominated by big corporate interests, this would have changed a long time ago, and these treaties would look very different. And so I think, by fixing our democracy at home, that alone could have a big global impact, because, frankly, the U.S. has a big, huge global impact in these treaties and elsewhere. So they're not disconnected at all, and I think we can make a lot of progress.
Well said. Egberto.
Yeah, now, Jeff, several things here. First of all, staying on the TPP a bit longer, how comes, and maybe you can tell me, when they decided to do these things as corporations to get these agreements together, these treaties together, should there be some sort of a law that we should have on our books as well, where if corporations are actually a part of this treaty negotiations, that we should have representation from the working class, maybe through unions or something as well? How comes that never ever? How comes we're talking about all of this secrecy with the corporate entities on a treaty that affects us all, but at the same time, the average American citizen doesn't really form a part of those who are engaging in the act?
Well, I think that's exactly. I think you put your finger on the problem. And I think the reason may well be because of the same kind of dynamic that we see with which is, I think, Citizens United has come to be somewhat shorthand for that problem of essentially, the people don't really matter, constituents don't really matter. The amount of money going into elections right now, it's not the amount that's the issue, although that's pretty significant too, $9 billion almost in the last election. It's where it comes from, and the vast majority of that comes from about 0.5% of the American people, and they're actually concentrated in about 5 metropolitan areas around New York, Washington, Boston, and L.A. and Chicago. The vast majority of the money is coming from a tiny segment, and that has had a systemic corrupting effect on our Congress. And so literally constituents' views aren't what is driving this process anymore. Labor unions are down to private sector labor unions are less than 7% of the private sector workforce right now. The same kind of corporate offensive that I describe in my book that's led to what Elizabeth Warren now calls the corporate capture of the courts has decimated organized labor. One of the cases that was decided after Citizens United, again, that I sometimes call the corporate veto, it struck down the right of workers to be notified even of their rights to organize in the workplace. That there was a notice requirement. The National Labor Relations Board decided was important to help workers decide for themselves whether they wanted to join a union or not. Struck down as a violation of corporate speech to require employers to post that notice. So, we've had this decimating attack on working people, on an attack on the input that any average American can have in all policies, and global trade negotiating because of it. It's an executive branch function essentially to negotiate the treaties with Congress having an approval up or down role. It's even that you have this combination of the sort of Citizens United based corruption of our system combined with an executive branch secretive foreign relations kind of issue, and combined you get a very closed process, to say the least. So it doesn't have to be that way, and there's some really people who know a lot more about it than I do, and I think Citizens Trade is one of the groups you've had on before, and Public Citizen and others are doing a lot of important work around TPP. So I think folks should check those out if they want to learn more.
Now, earlier on, you mentioned about the individual corporate rights, etc. I think there's something important that our audience needs to get, and I think this is something that we have to reinforce over and over again, because if you're sitting down, right now we're in Blog Talk Radio, and there are some people who are going to come to the show because they saw your name or they saw the Move to Amend name on the promos for the show, etc. And they hear the word corporate personhood and they hear the word free speech. I think they understand the free speech part pretty well. but I don't think they understand that personhood has a lot to do with that entity being able to have that free speech, or personhood has the deleterious effect that it has on their backyard, the company that's drilling in their backyard and what they have rights to do as individuals, the profit motive that these companies can recover if you alter what they do because they're persons. Can you elaborate to how they actually became persons?
Yeah, so there's it's sort of a problem of runaway metaphor because corporations, the idea that of a metaphor of the word person is not in itself the problem if you're not talking about constitutional law. So most corporate statutes in any state have a law that enables you to, if you wanted to start a business or get a business that you wanted to incorporate, you could take out the papers, and there's a state law, and it will essentially create a corporate entity that, under various laws, is considered like a quote-unquote person. And there's good reason for that. The Clean Water Act says, no person shall dump pollution into the waters of the country, and that's defined to include, any entity as well as human beings. So that part is not controversial. It makes sense. It's just a simple legal metaphor. The problem is, as I think Move to Amend has spent a great deal of effective effort at making clear, is that this was abused and twisted in the Gilded Age, in the Santa Clara case and the cases that followed. And it was an age much like ours, big concentrations of wealth and power in the big, what were called trusts, the big global, even less global certainly than we have now, but the equivalent of the biggest corporations, railroad, mining interests, all kinds of oil companies, all kinds of large corporations, essentially resisting the application of democratic, again, small d, democratic, Republican, small r, law. And so the railroads actually didn't like to be regulated. The oil companies didn't like to be regulated. And they took that the word person in the 14th Amendment in the Constitution, which absolutely was not intended to refer to corporations. It was the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, which was to make clear that all of us American human beings are equal in our country. And, we had just fought a civil war in which 700,000 people died to settle that question, that all human beings are equal. And the corporations at the time saw the word person, made an argument that should have been laughed out of court, that they were persons too, and the 14th Amendment meant that corporations couldn't have any regulation that wasn't applied to everything and everyone. And so they could use it to strike down laws that were attempting to regulate these giant, new, and dangerous at the time corporations. And they succeeded at the time by just over and over again coming to court with these arguments, huge amounts of money. Eventually, the court agreed, okay, corporations are persons, and they never really bothered to explain it about why corporations could have been persons in a constitution that opens with "we the people." And away they went, and we saw the court very activist, much like today, striking down labor laws. Even child labor laws were struck down. Maximum hour laws were struck down. Basically, any effort to try to get some kind of balance between corporate power and human beings was struck down under this theory. So that's the sort of modern or the last turn of the century version. Now, I talk about in my book about how I think the American people actually pushed back against that in the 20th century. That we had big battles over it. We had 4 constitutional amendments in 10 years in the progressive era. We had a wave of laws. We had state constitutional conventions that created things like the ballot initiative to drive more accountability and transparency and participation into democracy. And we had battles that changed the court eventually with the Roosevelt New Deal court. and we got some more balance back. And this sort of idea of corporations just wielding a constitutional right to strike down our laws really kind of fell back into the background, and we had some balance for a number of years until we now have the modern version of that, which I describe in my book, coming from Lewis Powell and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to essentially twist the First Amendment, freedom of speech, which is applied to the states through the 14th Amendment, which is the one about due process and equal protection of persons, to essentially create a new corporate constitutional right used to strike down our laws. So they simply try to sidestep the entire argument, much as the court did at the last Gilded Age, by not really deigning to explain it, and instead just using metaphors like speakers or voices. And my favorite metaphor in Citizens United, which of course struck down an election spending law that applied to corporations, that essentially Justice Kennedy referred to corporations as a disadvantaged class of person. So if you were feeling disadvantaged, just be grateful you're not a big corporation, because Justice Kennedy has made very clear they're a disadvantaged class of person. So, essentially we have these I think kind of waves of concentrated corporate power in our country, and if the people don't push back, we are in for a very bad time for a number of years. But I think people are pushing back, and we'll get balance again as we have before.
A quick question.
Hang on 1 second, because I just want to remind our listeners that if they have a question, to please call in. The number is 646-652-2345. Again, 646-652-2345. Press 1 after the prompt. Go ahead, Egberto.
Laura, one of these days I'm going to remember that we're a call-in show. And remember to do that a bit earlier. But enlighten me about something, Jeff. You alluded to the Powell letter several times. Isn't it true that the purpose of the Powell letter was, in effect, to make it obvious that, in effect, the corporate class needed to take control? Otherwise, majority rule would likely be dangerous to the type of society where we have that top-down super class over everybody else?
Well, in some senses, yes, and I think it was not only Lewis Powell. Let me give a little background, because it's an interesting story. Lewis Powell was a Richmond, Virginia lawyer. He was on the board, and not only on the board, on the executive committee of the Philip Morris Cigarette Corporation. This is in the late 60s, early 70s, and about 14 other corporate boards. And he was an advisor to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the big national chamber, not like your local chambers in your town or mine, but essentially the organized organization for the largest corporations in the country. And he looked with some dismay, as did others in his circles on these corporate boards, at democracy that was doing things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and the wave of environmental reform that we had after the Earth Day in 1970. And they looked with dismay on the regulations that were making autos a little bit safer. That there was actually, democracy was functioning well. 20 million people came out on Earth Day in April 1970. And, lo and behold, Congress responded. And so, Lewis Powell outlined this to the Chamber of Commerce as a problem, that, corporations had to get on top of this because, essentially, in my view, democracy was working, which would mean a little more balance in the power of the average person and the biggest corporation. And he laid out a game plan, which is interesting. I've got some of the memo in front of me, and if I could, I'll read a sentence or two to give your listeners some sense of how explicit this was. And he titled the memo "Attack on the American Free Enterprise System," and and talked about how the American economic system is under attack and that corporations had to organize and fund for as long as it took what he called a drive for united action to result in, quote, social, economic, and political change. And he says independent and uncoordinated activity by individual corporations, as important as this is, will not suffice. Strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations. And then he said about corporations driving social, economic, and political change, quote, under our constitutional system, especially with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. So he outlined a game plan explicitly involving the Supreme Court, and then Lewis Powell, 6 months later, was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by President Nixon and went on to write, in the space of about 6 years, 4 of the cases that created this idea of corporate speech under the First Amendment.
That is completely and entirely sad. I read that letter, I don't know, a few years ago, and it always struck me how, in effect, you could change a whole lot of those words and state that what they really believed in. And this may be harsh, but if you listen to the words, he really was intent on creating a fascist state. I mean, it doesn't say it quite that way, but in effect, he's saying we the corps, we the people at the top are the ones that not only must rule, but we must effect social change. We must effect the brainwashing that goes on today. And we can actually expand that a bit further, right? You and I, Laura, we all know, to move to men, we all know that it is really that these corporations are really doing a bad thing. We all know that a lot of the laws being passed are not a good thing. But if you, as Jeff Clements, who's written a book, who's done the research, attempt to make certain statements, it is amazing that those that are hurt by the corporations with the laws that's in their favors, with all these other issues, they will actually come out against you. So how do we build on the necessary education, as Powell did, in an effective way, in a timely manner, before it's too late?
Well, yeah, the time is now, and the work, I think, has already started. And the biggest piece, I think, has already moved a great deal, which is to no longer leave it to the courts or lawyers or politicians to fix, because those all have a role. But this is fundamentally a question for all Americans to have a national conversation about and address and fix, and that's the constitutional amendment movement and the power of that movement. So, I don't know what was in Lewis Powell's mind. When he was on the court, he was viewed as a moderate by some. He has a certain sort of Tidewater, Virginia aristocratic bearing, at least till he passed away. And so I think he was dismayed by some of what happened in the 60s, with riots in the streets, and whether he overreacted and for his preference for order in this kind of a memo, I don't know. It would be a fascinating story. Unfortunately, the main biography of Lewis Powell doesn't even touch the memo. You don't even know it happened. So it has been too long ignored. But of course, it's not just a memo, and it's not just Lewis Powell. It was that the movement for corporate rights, if you will, they did follow his advice. It was funded for many, many years with millions and millions of dollars, and organizations across the country stood up, things like ALEC and the SPN and the Washington Legal Foundation and others, and the Chamber Litigation Project, funded. So, these are huge adversaries that don't necessarily agree with a transparent, broadly empowered democracy. So I don't underestimate the challenge. But I do think, fortunately, we not only have right on our side, we have the founding principles of what this country is about, and I think that will bring people together across political differences, and that I think is the great power to win this. Is that Republicans agree on this, Democrats agree on this, Independents, Greens, Libertarians agree on this. We've tested this. We did a ballot initiative in Montana that was not just about money and politics, but was very explicit about the power of corporations, and that the people of Montana in this ballot initiative language have the right and duty to make the rules for corporations, not the other way around. And it said that corporations do not have constitutional rights. This is a state in Montana that went for Mitt Romney by 55%. 55% voted for Mitt Romney. They approved this ballot initiative that I'm talking about, 75% to 25%. So we can win this. We won't outspend the other side, but I think we have a lot on our side, including the vast majority of the American people.
Now,
the only tool they really have in their toolbox is their money, because the argument that we have is logical. It's based in common sense. It's based in the Constitution. I mean, when push comes to shove, we're the righteous ones.
Well, I think that's right, and I think it's more than righteousness too, because I think in the end, the best economy is one that is grounded in democracy. That this sort of short-term gain to have massive corporate power and massive political inequality. And we're now seeing that. I mean, just this week there was an AP survey of the top economists in the country saying that the gross disparity of inequality in this country is ruining the economy. And so, that's a logical conclusion. When people don't have any money to buy anything,
they don't spend.
You can't change jobs or start a business because you can't afford health care, you can't move from your current workplace. All of those kind of problems that result, when water is poisoned, when energy is blocked for any kind of renewable energy, when you have all of these problems mounting, you don't just have so-called activists or so-called movement people. You have everyone working together, whether they agree or disagree on sort of how we got here. They want the country to work. They want the economy to work. They want their kids to grow up in a country that functions again. And I think that people are getting that. We have 2,000 business leaders who've signed on to the constitutional amendment work. I think people know that this is not about anti-corporate or anti-right or anti-left. It's really about how can Americans fix this project to move forward again, this country. And so that's where I think we will be able to prevail. That the narrow interest, that the sort of Chamber, Lewis Powell vision, it just doesn't work for the country. And so I think it's why it shifted in the last Gilded Age, and we got the Progressive Era, and we got change. And I think we're going to go through one of those shifts again, and sooner than we think, because the country will demand it.
Now, let me ask you, and this is not intended to be partisan, but I just want to get your impressions and my bearings. When would you say the actual decline began? In other words, the move from progressivism to, progressism, right? Towards where we are right now.
I as I said, I kind of tend to trace it to the early 70s when the shift happened, but I use a little bit of a different analysis. I actually think For too long, we have allowed what I think more of as corporatists to be lumped with conservatives, and they're not the same. So
right.
I don't know if the progressivism has all the answers, or I'm sure there are conservatives who know that conservatism or libertarianism certainly doesn't have all the answers. In the end, it's a dynamic process, and the country usually does better when there's a healthy debate of ideas and compromising and sort of, in some ways, just muddling forward, but that's the democratic process.
Right.
I think what went wrong is the democratic process, again, small d, the process of a republic functioning well, was a problem of corporatism becoming dominant, so that, right and left and progressive and conservative became, something that divided us a lot. But in the meantime, the constant that went on, no matter who was in power, Republican or Democrat, the constant that went on was slowly declining wages, slowly eroding environmental protections, slowly loss of sovereignty in towns and cities and states. It became a process where, over time, the sort of corporatist agenda prevailed. I've got to say, I describe in the book, in those cases that Lewis Powell wrote that kind of created the idea of corporate speech to turn the First Amendment into a tool to strike down laws. One of the big dissenters, and there were others, but one of the surprising dissenters was William Rehnquist, another Nixon appointee, a conservative.
Wow.
And he was dissenting in passionate terms about how the economic and the political are two different things, and if you confuse them, republics become endangered. And he was advocating quite clearly that there should not be a corporate speech idea, and that corporations should not be treated as people under the Constitution. So, I think we have had an erosion of our democracy over these past 40 years. But again, I think if we can, and it's hard sometimes, but if both sides, all sides, right and left, can kind of try to look beyond the passion of the things that divide us and see the long-term trends and the source of those trends, I think that's where we can get things like 75% of people in Montana calling for fundamental, significant reform.
That is so good. Let me ask you. We're near the end of the hour. Could you?
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Which is kind of an uplifting one, because when you start peeling back these layers, it's sad. I feel bad for us as a nation, as a country, for our democracy when I start hearing all this stuff. And every 2 and 4 years, we go out and we elect new people. And as you said, sometimes they're left, sometimes they're right. Any way you look at it, we end up, with corporations benefiting more than the rest of us. But the good news is we're coming into an election year. And I think now is an important time to think about, whether you're on the left or whether you're on your right. Part of your duty as a citizen in being in the electoral process isn't to just go throw a lever, depending on what party you're in, but to actually find out who you're voting, of the people that you can vote for, the people on your ballot, who supports, the idea that corporations are people, and who supports the idea that the Constitution was right, that corporations are not people. And to just go and know right from your local candidates on up to the federal ones, where these candidates stand on this issue, because we have a lot of important issues. You hear about, income inequality being the number one issue in the day, and it's the number one, immediate issue. But how do we get here? As Jeff has explained, it's all part of this corporate rule, the corporate personhood, the expansion of corporate rights through the Supreme Court, and so by raising this issue and getting people on record, who to vote for. If you want to really fix the problem, the systemic problem that's stopping us from solving all kinds of issues, then one of the things that you can do coming up is bird dog your candidates and find out where they stand.
Yeah, I think that is important. I think it is important to not sort of end on a down note, and that there are things you can do, and they're things that really do make a difference. So, when we started this, collectively, all of us working in this effort, people would say it's ridiculous. You're not going to get anywhere with a constitutional amendment movement. Well, just at the end of the year in 2011, 2 states had passed resolutions demanding a 28th Amendment. The end of December 2012, it was up to 11 states. It's now up to 16 states. There was 2 years ago, maybe 1 or 2 amendment bills that were sort of weak at the time. Not. It was good. They were there, but they weren't getting at the corporate person issue, and they weren't doing enough on the money and politics issue. We now have good, strong amendment bills introduced in the House, introduced in the Senate. The We the People amendment that Move to Amend is supporting is a very good, strong one. Free Speech for People supports the same 2-prong approach. They're in 2 different bills, but they're both introduced in the House and Senate, which also gets at both problems. So we're making a lot of progress, and I think it's like every other advance of democracy in our country. If people didn't essentially do the impossible, we never would have had a chance. But people did the impossible, and I think we can do that too. And asking candidates where they stand and really demanding that they get on board the right amendments and support amendments, and it really does matter. And we'll continue to make progress, and we'll win in the end. I think it's either it's win or go home and go down. So I intend to stay in this, and I know you all do too.
Absolutely, Jeff. Please tell us a little bit about how our members can find you and about your book as we close the hour.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Egberto. freespeechforpeople.org is the Free Speech for People website. We have a ton of resources there. Check it out. There's a lot of summaries, and there's always new interesting stuff going on, including the Legal Advisory Committee. And I'll just say a quick word on that. It's part of our legal advocacy program. We have a host of scholars and former state Supreme Court justices, including Justice James Nelson, who was a Montana judge in the Montana case that challenged Citizens United, who wrote a great dissent talking about corporations are not persons under the Constitution, that it's an affront to human dignity to talk about them that way. And he retired after 20 years on the Montana Supreme Court and has joined our Legal Advisory Committee. So check out freespeechforpeople.org. I know Move to Amend, of course, .org has a ton of resources as well. But you can find me over also at corporationsarenotpeople.com. It's sort of a blog that I update now and then. So I look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you very much. Laura, you want to bring us home? We have about 30 seconds.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you again, Jeff. It's been great having you on the show. And to all our listeners and supporters, have a very Merry Christmas, a happy holiday, and a wonderful New Year. We trust you'll find some time to be in the arms of your loved ones, with your family and friends, to recharge those batteries so we can come out swinging on the 1st. Happy holidays.
Hey, Jeff, thank you very much. This was a great hour, a very informative hour. And to all our members, happy holidays, and thank you for spending some time with us. Everybody, have a wonderful rest of. Bye-bye.